Hi, I'm Andrew McLaren.
And I'm Mark Ridley.
Welcome to the Teamcraft podcast,
where we talk about the tradecraft and sometimes the witchcraft of what it means to work together in a team.
Our guest today is Lieutenant Colonel Matt Johns, MBE. After graduating from university, Matt started his career as an officer in the British Army in 2005, going through the Army's world-renowned Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. This was an intense period for the UK Armed Forces, with conflict going on in Iraq and Afghanistan, where Matt did multiple deployments, as well as time in Kenya and Germany. He then went back to work in the delivery of the officer training programme at the Sandhurst Military Academy. From there, Matt retired from the Army and co-founded Fieri Leadership and Development, a consultancy and education organisation that supports leadership development across all sectors, from professional sport to pharmaceuticals. Fieri has a range of top-level clients on its books, including blue-chip companies and Premier League football clubs. In this episode, expect to hear about structure, rank and hierarchies in teams, action-centred leadership, the muscle memory of teamwork. We talk about focusing on team results rather than individual results, and how sometimes you don't want a high-performing team, just a performing team.
In the Army, there's a lot of emphasis on how you behave as a leader and the whole idea of servant leadership. What can you do to enable your people? And when we started doing some consulting, some commercial work, it was really interesting that a lot of leadership training was about knowledge transfer, telling people what they should do rather than showing them or getting them to feel it. And so I think that's the key thing that we've been working on, is looking at those behaviours. How do you behave as a leader, and giving people opportunities to practice and play with new skills and new ideas, and with very experienced people to sort of point them in the right direction. So it's one of those win-wins where you do feel it's having a lot of value to people, but it's great fun. It's really enjoyable position to be in, to feel like you're helping other people.
Was that a surprise to you? You know, when you started having a great deal more exposure to the commercial world, let's say, or other different organizational contexts, and what maybe you took for granted, the level of discipline, the level of real appreciation and understanding of leadership from the point of view of Army officer training and actual practice of command in the Army?
I think the Army is a big organisation. Regardless of what it does, it has all the features of a large organisation. It tends to have very good people, but of all organisations, there's a huge spread of knowledge and ability. And so there are more similarities than differences when you look at other large organisations. But the biggest difference is, by the time you're sort of a mid-level leader, you could have had 2.5 years of leadership training, whilst you could get into a comparable position in other organisations, and you get there because you're really good at the technical element, and you may have been on a few courses, and you may have been lucky enough to be mentored or be in a very strong environment. But we have quite an advantage because of the amount of time and emphasis we put on training, which makes sense, because if you're going to take people away somewhere where there's danger, where you need them to do something pretty difficult at times, you need that level of assurance. You need to make sure your leaders know what they're doing. So that was the biggest thing. You'd see people in reasonably senior positions, and they hadn't had that benefit of training experience, making the mistakes early on. Because you can be in your early 20s and you could be in charge of 30 people in the Army. And of course you make mistakes, but it's structured in such a way that you can develop, you can learn from your mistakes, you can do a good job whilst also learning. And so what we sometimes see is there are people who may be in their 40s, 50s, who are learning lessons where we were lucky enough to get our junior commanders learning in their 20s. And that's the biggest difference, not having that advantage of the time to develop in a leadership role.
So presumably they're learning quite high cost lessons potentially.
One pattern we see is people are very gifted technically, whatever the field they're in. They're really good at their job, be it a lawyer, an accountant, an engineer, really good at it, and they'll promote into positions where sometimes they're quite quickly in charge of hundreds, maybe thousands within a business unit. And they're not necessarily geared up to be able to deal with that. And some people find that transition very, very difficult. It's either a very steep learning curve, or they require a huge amount of support. And there is issues. People do sometimes suffer from that. And it's easy when you look back to see the benefit of having leadership training as a constant throughout your career, so that when you get to the more senior positions, then you're more prepared for it, rather than, right, congratulations, you're now in this really quite senior leadership position, here's your training and off you go. It doesn't work like that. It's not like sort of inserting a computer disk in and then suddenly you've got the skills to do it. It's learned behaviours over a long period of time. And don't get me wrong, there's incredible leaders in all of the organisations and all of the sectors that we work in. But I think it's harder to get there because you haven't got the same level of support or the same sort of organisational structure around you as you're lucky enough to have if you're in something like the army.
Matt, we had an interesting comment from one of the guests that we spoke to before, which was talking about, I think one of the things that Andrew and I have definitely seen is this fetishization of teams. I work a lot in tech, and everything is a team in tech. But by default now, that is that it's the only structure that exists. You join a team and you're in the team. One of our previous guests talked about the real purpose of a team existing was actually almost only for, this isn't universally true, but this was a perspective, that the point of the team existing was almost only to be given direction. The team came together, they were given their jobs for the week, and then they went away. And so we were really looking into that, what does being in a team really mean? But my sense is that you're teaching skills that are much deeper than that. It's not just come to be told what the command is, but you're teaching skills that go much deeper. What are those types of things? What really calls out the benefits of being in a team other than just be given a command?
So from my perspective, I think it's a lot simpler than sometimes people make it out to be. It's almost like, if you don't understand something, you can make it really complicated, can't you, when you're trying to explain it to others? I see that with leadership and being part of a team. It's a really natural thing. We've evolved to have these behaviours as collaborative behaviours. It's one of our advantages, isn't it? It gives us a competitive advantage. And so it's quite a natural thing to be part of a group of people. And also quite a natural thing for the person with maybe more experience or ability to maybe take a lead. So these are quite natural things. And one of the things that I just think helps massively, and it's not complicated, is just putting some structure around that. So that when people are dealing with adversity or dealing with difficulty, or even with routine matters, everybody knows their part within it. And you can't do leadership training if you don't train the team, is what we know. And so I love action-centered leadership. It's so simple. If you haven't come across it, it's one of the more widely recognized models, because it's so simple. You can explain it to people in 10 minutes, but doing it's a lot harder. But everybody in the team needs to understand it. They understand that the leader isn't elevated in a position for any other reason than the team needs somebody. At the end of the day, you can't have collaborative decision making on everything, particularly if it's a crisis. And if everybody knows the parts, they can react accordingly. So I think it's as simple as everybody needs to know the rules. They need to know why the person's in charge and what's expected of them. And you need to know what's expected within the team. And I think going back to the army example, that becomes a bit of muscle memory, because the way you train, you practice, we're lucky enough to have the rank system, which can help bring a little bit more order to it. Because it's only at those times when I think a team is under pressure that you really need that structure and you really need that leader to be in a situation where they can actually lead. And certainly what we've seen in a lot of organizations within tech, a lot of sectors within tech, is a lot of teams are structured for the same day-to-day problems. So when everything's going fine, then they're optimized. But it's when things aren't going fine, that's when things become difficult. And, collaborative decision making, having maybe ego-based conversations about, I think we should do that, you think we should do that, not having cohesion, that's when things start to get tricky, when it's a very, very complicated problem or a critical problem, something that has to happen very, very quickly. And that's when that structure becomes very, very important.
I think that's so interesting. I'm actually going through a situation exactly like that at the moment with a relatively new team or a team that aren't familiar with each other, where those boundaries aren't clear. And I think the muscle memory of teamship that you spoke about was super interesting. And actually, just in the last week with this team going through a crisis, I was using the example of a kitchen, where you see that sort of very well drilled muscle memory, and it doesn't really exist in tech. So tech is generally normally people working in tech are very creative, which isn't, I think, for an outsider what you think, but their job is go away and think creatively about a problem on your own. But when there's a crisis, you have to collaborate, and you have to have clear leadership, and prioritization and focus and communication is key. So I'd see that a lot, especially with teams when, just like you're talking about, the muscle memory isn't there. But there is actually a really positive upside to those crisis moments, which is the strongest teams that I've seen form are the ones that form in the crisis. And they're often the ones that then look back and think, actually, no, we do need to build the muscle memory. We do need communication. We do need a hierarchy. And they start to appreciate it much more. And I think in the military, you are probably training that muscle memory for teamship much more. And again, maybe kitchens are another place where that happens. But very few places teach teamship, I think, the way that the military does.
I'd agree. And if you look at warfare, it's ultimately chaotic, and the more you can have, the more certainty you can bring to the situation, the more control you can bring to it, the more likely you are to achieve what you need to. And the old adage, control the controllables. And if you can go into a situation which might be complex, might be stressful, if everybody has got an understanding of how they're meant to function, and they know the role of the leader, they know what's expected of them, but you still retain that adaptability and that flexibility. If you can set those conditions and you don't have to worry about that, you can concentrate and prioritize on other things. So I think, yes, I think kitchen's a great example where people know their part. And if everything's working together, then that's fantastic. Then that's brilliant. But maybe trying to sort of bring the army bit to light. If you think of the kitchen example, but something unexpected happens within the kitchen environment, something breaks, 30 more guests come in, there's something's not happening with an individual. That's when the training comes in for the team and individual, the team and the person in charge to be set up to also be able to deal with that. And that's one of the biggest differences I think we see with a lot of teams in other areas. They're great at the management space, which is getting stuff done that we're expecting to happen. It's when there's a significant change or an environmental factor that changes, that's when those teams don't necessarily have the depth of being a team. And you often find at that moment they're a team in name only. They don't really know each other. They're not invested in each other in the way that maybe a more traditional old-fashioned team where they actually live in the same place and see each other every day, and they know the names of each other's kids, and they know a lot about each other. So I think that's one of the biggest differences we see, that the team isn't necessarily as gelled as you need it to be when things aren't going your way.
I find it really interesting that we've used the analogy of a kitchen. I've done research on kitchen teams in the past, and the history of professional kitchen teams is that the structure and the way in which a professional kitchen team is managed is ripped completely from the military. It's entirely based on military. Yeah. If memory serves me correctly, part of that is because one of the earliest requirements for an organised kitchen brigade, the word brigade gives you a clue, was in the military. They needed to cater, and you will know how important catering and catering corps.
What's the catering corps? It's now part of the Royal Logistics Corps.
Yeah, it's fundamental to being effective on deployment and elsewhere. So it's funny how that's the analogy. The interesting thing is, I think with both the armed forces and something like the professional kitchen, is there's a very visceral and immediate sense of when something's right and wrong. The food goes out correctly, cooked properly, on time, in the right order, with the other plates. Does it happen or does it not? And the other side is actually, I think, you see the symmetry of how leadership is embedded in the structure. So even aside from the very, very most junior member of a kitchen brigade, after that, everybody experiences responsibility for leadership at every stage they progress through. And it's interesting how that that metaphor plays on, isn't it?
Not that I was just looking this up in the background, but Escoffier created the French Brigade, and he served in the military in the 1800s and brought the French Brigade. And then I think kitchens around the world after Escoffier's work started to copy the French Brigade system.
Wow, interesting. If you ever get the chance, military chefs are awesome, by the way. They know what they're doing. They can work wonders with not a lot of money and a lot of time as well. But that's fascinating. I never knew that link, but it does make sense. And there's one feature that's quite interesting, I think, sort of going back to the bit about sort of comparing teams in maybe other environments. And one thing that you get in, certainly towards the more junior teams, is that the person in charge is usually younger and less experienced than quite a lot of the team. Not all, but quite a lot of the team. They've had the benefit of doing their officer training, so they've had a year of leadership and role-specific training. They've been selected to be the right people, but they're young, early in their career, high levels of energy, likely to have adaptability in terms of how they look at a problem. But what you'll have alongside them is a senior non-commissioned officer, or it could be a warrant officer, a sergeant major, depending on what level we're talking about. And that is somebody who's maybe joined the organisation from school at 16, 17 and worked their way up. And they'll be a bit older and they'll have been around. They'll have a lot of context. And that pairing works really, really well more often than not. So you've got the full of energy, well-trained, very current, driving things. And then you've got that check balance of somebody who's got a huge amount of context. And I think either one of them leading on their own wouldn't necessarily get the most out of that team. But if that pair are tight, the team have not got a chance in terms of they are going to operate to a high level and they're going to get stuff done and they're going to enjoy doing it as well. And so I haven't seen any other organisation that really does that pairing. And it doesn't, on the face of it, it doesn't seem amazing. It doesn't it seems unusual. Why have you got the younger person in charge and the more experienced person? Why aren't they leading it? But I think that balance and that mutual respect is really, really helpful.
I can think of an example where it doesn't work because it's not demonstrated the importance of making that relationship effective, which is in healthcare, especially in the NHS. You'll get a newly qualified doctor. That's a dynamic that is, again, they've been selected based on qualifications. They've gone through a high level of challenging training. They are on paper smart, capable, and very well qualified people. And then they go into a live clinical environment where they will be being shown the ropes by a nurse who may have been there for 35 years and knows by smelling the room what's going on with this patient in reality and what the course of treatment, management approach should be. And the doctor is there kind of flustering around. But the interesting comparison is that in healthcare, that's a schism, that's a dynamic that's very problematic. And some of it comes down to, I think, poor training and poor appreciation of the value that experience among the nurses offers, and accepting and being humble about the fact that doctors may be all of those very great things, but they definitely aren't experienced.
No, I think you're right. I think training is a huge factor, and not just these are some models around leadership, and this is what we expect from you. It's that actual training together, off the ball or outside of the operating theatre, and I do feel for occupations like people who work in health where they are doing it every day. They can't just go offline and spend a couple of weeks or a month getting their team together and training and getting themselves sorted, and then bang, we're going to go back into it, and then have that pause and reflect. They don't have that. The military, luckily, we do have that opportunity to prepare before we go somewhere more often than not, prepare extensively as a team. So by the time you get out there, if anything, you've trained beyond the level that you need, which is a great feeling when you head out there, and then you do what you need to, then you come back and recover. But a lot of occupations, they don't get that. You're doing it day in, day out, and that's hard going, I think, for any team.
In the army, in the military, maybe by osmosis, but maybe very directly and instrumentally, that idea of, right, I'm starting from this knowing that the best way to address the situation is through effective teamwork. And that then grows naturally over time, as opposed to it being actually quite an alien feeling to relinquish that sense of, actually, it's not really about whether I get this right or wrong. It's about knowing what the best way to reaching a solution is.
That's interesting. I think that the way it's kind of trained within the army, it's about team success and team results. And again, go back to that sort of the ethos of serve to lead. Your job as a leader, it's made very clear, is about enabling your people to succeed. So you're there trying to help them to do what they need to do, rather than what you may see in some industries where the team is almost like a support function for the leader, where the leader's the star of the show and everything else is there to basically allow them to do what they need to do. And it can't work like that in the military setting, particularly with the amount of specialism these days, where it could be a 20-year-old private soldier who is the most qualified and competent on a bit of equipment, or has done this amount of training in this area. So it means that it's about bringing that individual to bear when it's the right time to do so, and supporting them and helping them get where they need to go. And there is a lot strong emphasis on celebrating team success. And of course, you get individuals that stand out from time to time, and that's not shunned upon, but largely it's about how we've done as our unit, how, that huge amount of identity around that unit, and feeling like you belong to something. And I think that's really, really useful. And no individual has the opportunity to get above themselves, a bit bigger than the team, really. It's about the cohesiveness and the effectiveness of that unit, really. And if you look at the practical reality of warfare, it's, well, the members of the team may change, people may get injured or worse, and you might need to swap people in, but retain your effectiveness. So maybe that's the reason why.
When I was at Sandhurst recently, Matt, I was down there. One of the things that really struck me about the passing out parade, and they award the sword. I can't remember what it's called now. It's got a special name.
Sword of Honor. Yeah,
the Sword of Honor, and the explanation about why the Sword of Honor is given, and it's all about teamwork, basically. It's not given to the person who ran around the course in the fastest time. It's about the person who stopped to help someone else who was struggling, and that kind of thing. And I just find that amazing that that kind of symbolic award, albeit to an individual, but that symbolic award to an individual in a leadership academy, basically, is about teamwork.
And I think one of the other facets of military teams, from my experience, is the use of sense of humour, keeping things light, even when things aren't particularly light. And I think that's a real strength. We see that in teams in other industries that are really together. They can maybe speak more freely. They can joke with each other. They can be maybe a little bit more risque. And they've definitely got that safety, that psychological safety around them. And you certainly get a lot of that in the military. And it just made me think, when you talk about the Sword of Honor as an example, one of the practice parades at Sandhurst, and the Sword of Honor winner's going to practice doing, the steps that they need to when they get presented with it. And somebody had taken the real sword and replaced it with one with a blade about sort of 6 or 7 inches long. So when the poor guy went to pull out, it looks like a fork. It looks like a dinner knife, really, in front of all of the cadets at the academy. Sort of none of the public were at that stage. So I think that sense of humour is really important in gelling a team together, from my experience, anyway.
That's actually probably quite a nice segue into the question that I was going to ask, which was intended, I guess, to bring us crashing back to the mundane a little bit. So we all love talking about high performance teams, and we've talked a lot about how important teamship is in a crisis. But in the UK, there's something like 20 million people working for small businesses. And this was definitely one of the things that I really wanted to investigate. And Andrew and I have spoken a lot about this, challenging that orthodoxy of what being in a team means. For most people, in most jobs, they don't really face crises, or at least not of the scale that we're talking about. In tech, sometimes it's important for some of the teams that I work with, but if you think about the average tech team, tech and product team building something digital, the biggest crisis that they have is they get asked to put something live faster. In a sales team working together, the biggest crisis they have is their sales targets are higher and it's month end. So in a normal team, so in teams in day-to-day life where they're not going to face a crisis, they are just working with other people, do we even need teams? And what parts of being in a team are really useful to those every day, day-to-day? I work in a smaller business. Is performance really important?
We one of the frameworks you learn in the army, if you're on sort of doing leadership training, is from a psychologist called Keith Grint, and you may come across, and he talks about tame problems, wicked, and crises. And if you look at his definition of crisis, it doesn't have to be explosion or something big. It's something. It's not a day-to-day problem that you need to deal with. It could be two people going sick and there's no process in place for that to happen. But it's something that requires the leader to take control of that situation and be maybe more coercive than they would normally to make things happen. So I think if you lower the criteria of what a crisis is to that, then they happen every time within teams. And therefore, you always need somebody who people know to look to and who is enabled to be able to deal with those things that aren't the normal day-to-day. I think if you're talking about sort of in the management space where everything is going to plan, you've got brilliant processes, you're using some sort of system, you've systemized the way you go about your business and everyone knows their part within it. It still needs somebody, I think, somebody who's able to just look at what's around the next corner, what's going on. Everything's fine at the moment. There's always room for optimization. And if everybody's there doing the doing, then if nobody's got that capacity to look horizon scan for problems or horizon scan for opportunities, I would say that team may be efficient at that moment in time, but it's not going to stay there. So I think even when things are finely tuned, still it makes sense to have that function of leadership, though it might look very different. It might mean that that's called upon infrequently than if you're in a more chaotic environment or a more complex environment where it's you really need somebody then to sort of cohese and bring things together.
Leadership is it's vital, but generally speaking, like you said, you can't train leaders without training the team. And actually, there wouldn't be a particular need for leadership without there being people that needed led. So they're so interdependent. What do you need to do to foster good team citizenship? Either as a leader or at an organizational level, what messages are you sending those team members? Say, this is the kind of thing that is going to make you more effective at doing teamwork.
I think there needs to be a shared sense of purpose, whatever you're doing, for that team to be anywhere near effective. And I think if you've got that everyone's looking and pulling in the right direction, in the same direction, then a lot of your issues go away, I think. So there has to be that shared sense of purpose. And I think sometimes the role of, when that is in place, sometimes that role of the leader is reminding people of why their role is important in the bigger picture. And where they fit into it all. And sometimes just recommunicating the same things, it's spending that time reminding people of the importance of what they're doing, and why we're going in a certain direction, and making sure that people aren't a constant, are they? They may come into something with a huge sense of purpose and real clarity in what they're doing, and a month later they may be slightly more jaded and slightly more confused. So sometimes the role that on a personal level, that role of the leader is to refocus or remind people and make sure that you can't take cohesion for granted. It requires maintenance. If you don't look after it, it'll dissipate. And so proactive leaders can stop you from getting anywhere near a crisis by making sure you're constantly oiling the machine and keeping people happy, keeping people focused. And one of the other things you're taught really early on, but throughout your career as a sort of a military leader, is about, there's always that friction between looking after the team as a whole unit, looking after the needs of individuals, who will sometimes need you more than other times, and of course dealing with the task. And you're always bouncing between the three and always helping the team focus on the right thing. That's why I always find the concept of high performance teams quite interesting, because I think a lot of organizations don't actually want high performance teams. They want teams that are performing well, but they don't want teams with their foot on the accelerator all the time, because they'll burn out. And sometimes if you're too task orientated, that team will start to fray around the edges, and sometimes you need to move the focus elsewhere.
Just following on from that, there's a reason that I was thinking about the small businesses before, and I feel like it's a really underserved area, because some of the best thinking in how to structure teams and how to train managers that's come from commercial businesses comes from some of those big tech companies. So in Google, there was Project Aristotle and Project Oxygen. They did loads of research, and they're in such a fortunate position because they can metricize their team behavior and their manager behavior, and they can collect it and do research. But it's just not realistic. And I've been fortunate enough to work in larger companies where we really do think about how do we create high performance teams. We did a lot of training in one of the teams that I worked with, the RAF, with the officer selection program. We actually used as a training method. But I was just really, really lucky to have the time and the space to think about that. These smaller businesses, and we're sort of thinking about businesses that might be less than 50 people. There's probably a lot of staff churn. People are moving from business to business. These are not companies that are building high performance teams. Like you say, they're teams where they just need to be doing a good job. Are there any, reflecting on your experiences, where it's not how do I build a high performance team that is going to be together for years, are there any particular things that you would call out, bits of advice that you would give for those leaders in smaller businesses? Could be family owned, it's people on the high street that have a small number of employees. What are the critical things that they need to be thinking about to keep their teams working?
I think that's a really good question. And I've been there, or I am there, running a small organization, not in tech, but and the challenges that faces, and the tricky bit that when you need that organization, when you need that structure and you need that training, you can't afford it. It's not a proportionate use of your time or your resources. So the people who need it the most maybe don't get the benefit of the examples that you just gave about large organizations who can throw resources and time at problems and get them done to an incredible level. I think one of the massive advantages you have as a small organization is that you've usually got the opportunity to select the people around you. And it's a lot harder to do that in a large organization, to can repeatedly pick the right people. And that's why system and structure becomes more important. And I think if, as a small organization, you pick the right people with the right purpose, the right level of motivation, you've got the same goals, then there are huge advantages to that in pushing you forward until you get to that situation where, you've got the bigger organization problems of how do we put some structure around this? We're now going to need to bring in more people, so we're going to have to sort of think a bit more about it. But I think when you're at that very small level, even one wrong hire can completely, maybe even stop what you're doing. Or have a really, really critical effect on how you're going about bits and pieces. So being able to understand people and having some experience in who you want on your team is quite important. And if you look at a lot of entrepreneurs, they usually will go into an area because they've got an idea or a concept in an area that they know really, really well, but they may not have had the experience of building a team before, or in being able to deal with some of the sort of the people issues that are going to happen. So I think if somebody's going to go out, punch out on their own, I think if they've had the experience of working in a larger organization, even for a little bit, that can be quite useful because they can see what maybe good is going to look like. I think there's also a huge role for education, and there are government schemes like Help to Grow, which I know they run at Heriot-Watt, for example, which you can get pretty much free, really good training to help you to deal with some of these novel issues that you haven't had to deal with before. So I think sort of in summary, the work is cut out. If you're an entrepreneurial leader in a small team, your work is really cut out. But you can pick the people around you, which gives you a big advantage. You can educate yourself and you can get yourself some experience. I think that's going to inoculate you a little bit from the trials and tribulations that you're going to face anyway, and you just have to get over them.
Just as a quick follow-up to that, I love that you picked out the hiring piece, and it's another area that I'm completely fascinated with. But again, thinking about some some jobs in industries, particularly again kitchens and in hairdressing. There's this concept of the trial shift. So you come in and you're actually put on the front lines and you're watched how you do the job. Most interviews in most normal office-based white-collar type businesses are totally useless because it's somebody sitting across a table and asking you some questions about what you've done in the past. And there's actually some great material, some great research has been done on this, which we'll hopefully link out to. But are there any tips that you'd give in that selection phase? And I know this is a different topic, and it's but more in your maybe the learnings you've taken from your military background, but also being in a civilian situation where you can't do a selection day. What tips can you give for how you select those close people around you?
I'd be lucky enough to work at the Army Officer Selection Board, which is where we pick the people who go through to Sandhurst, which is probably, if not the biggest, one of the biggest assessment centres in Britain. It runs pretty much every week of the year, but bar sort of holiday periods, and it'll have, I don't know, maybe it's something like 100 people go through each week, something like that. So it's a really interesting machine, quite a privilege to sort of, be part of it. And I've also had the opportunity to work or set up assessment centres for other organisations. And the research points to, if you're looking for potential, are you looking for performance or potential? Performance is easy. You need somebody to drive a forklift truck. Here's the keys, drive it around for a little bit. Yep, they can drive a forklift truck. Let's hire them. I think potential is the harder part. That is the really tricky piece. And the research points to intelligence being the greatest predictor of potential, whatever you're going to be doing. So picking smart people, whatever it is that you're going to ask them to do, is definitely a good thing to do. And there are some pretty good psychometric tools out there. None of them are perfect. That gives you a good indication of where that person may sit, or you can tell from their academic profile is quite useful, or the things that they've done can give you a good idea of where they're at. I think the other bit that's important is whether they're a cultural fit for where you are as an organisation. And the tricky part is that you do need to get to know somebody. So I agree, the 15-minute interview, the completely false environment, even if you're using good competency-based questions, is too false. So it's not a coincidence. A lot of larger organisations, there are several stages. It might start with a coffee. It always starts with a coffee, doesn't it? With somebody in the organisation. Then you might meet other members of the team and so on. So you're a known entity before you come to the more formal selection bit. And I think whether it's declared or not, the subtext of that process is this individual going to fit into my team or my organisation? So I think the longer you can spend getting to know that person, and you can do that as a entrepreneur in a small team. You can meet somebody several times. It's not going to cost you a huge amount, and it's going to make sure that hire decision is critical when there's 2 or 3 of you, or even sort of 10, 15 of you. That one person could be that's a big decision. That's a big expenditure of resources and a lot of faith you're putting in them. So definitely understand, are they a smart cookie or not, is useful if it's appropriate to try and get a measure of that, and whether they're a good fit is quite important. I think the work sampling tasks are always interesting. So, throwing somebody into a kitchen today and see if they sink or swim. If they're an experienced chef, then that's great. But if they're new to it, I don't think you're going to get a huge amount out of that. So I think it's trying to break down the role into what is it that I'm actually going to need them to do, and what are the markers that I can then build on. Certainly in our organisation, some of the best hires that we've ever brought in haven't worked in the industry before. And sometimes that's a huge advantage, but they're super motivated, they fit in, they're pulling in the same direction as everybody else, and they want to do well. And I take people like that every single time over somebody who's maybe been in the industry for years and years and years, but isn't really looking. They haven't got their ambitions, or they haven't got their purpose in the same direction as everyone else. That's when you're going to get the high churn. And it was interesting, you did reference earlier about some of these organisations having high churn, and that would have my alarm bells ringing straight away. If you're trying to build a project, how can you get people in? How can you get them invested in it so they're not going to disappear? Because it takes months and months, doesn't it, to get somebody to get anywhere near competent and capable. It's meant to be short for a small organisation, but I haven't seen that really. I've seen it takes probably the same amount of time in a small organisation as a large organisation to get up to speed. But you don't want people leaving, so stopping that happening, I think, is quite important.
Do you think there's enough appreciation of just how much effort and energy and attention that part of it requires. You know, the sort, I mean, I guess you could call it the onboarding, but thinking about a project, the recognition that everyone needs to be really clear. You've mentioned it before, like really talking about common ground, you know, so people really actually understand what everyone wants to achieve. And then do they genuinely, sincerely buy into that? And even a lot of the research in this talks about how an invested team needs to have had a sense of participating in the development of the goals as well. You know, it's not just here's a task list that is handed to you. In fact, you have some intrinsic ownership of the goal itself. Because, I mean, I my favorite is, you know, the stuff to do with the commissioner of the Met and the destruction of the trust in policing at the hands principally of the Metropolitan Police in the UK. And the kind of lines coming from politicians, you know, you had like Boris Johnson saying it, the new commissioner saying people need to trust the police. And I suppose I'm using trust as a proxy here, but, you know, my reaction to that was, you don't get to tell people that they need to trust. You earn trust, and that's the only way you get it. The only way you get it is by earning it. And similarly with building a team, the only way you get to that point of charismatic, enthusiastic engagement and people really investing in it is that if you give them the opportunity and the space and the compassion, I suppose, to genuinely get invested in it. Am I off the chart here, or am I
no? I think
accurate.
I think everybody wants to come to work or whatever they're working on, and they want to feel good about themselves, what they're doing. They want to be validated, and that's really important. You've got to make people feel good about what they're doing, especially when things are really tricky. And I think that's one of the things that you can do as a leader or as a team member to help that cohesion. It involves everybody needing to do that. How are you? What have you done to make that new member of the team feel part of it, or the other people? How have you helped them today, really? And if everybody's really aware of the importance of that they do a little bit every day to enhance that cohesion, if you've got that culture, then that's going to save you a lot of issues. I think the other thing that people really want, as well as feeling good about themselves in terms of their status and how they're treated, how they're accepted in the group, they want consistency from whoever's running the show. And if you get to the stage where the team kind of know what the person in charge is going to say or think or what they want to get involved in, then that makes life a lot easier. So I think if leaders are consistent in their expectations and what they want, it makes the lives of everybody else around them. And so I think if you have those two factors in place, everybody's taking ownership for making people feel validated, and it's genuine, it's authentic, and there's consistency in the role of the leader, then I think a lot of the problems you see in teams go away, or you can trace it back to one of those things happening. People don't feel validated, they don't feel accepted or part of what's going on, or they don't, they suffer from that inconsistency, which goes through to what am I meant to be doing? How's that person going to react to this? It causes a lot of stress, and that affects how that team's going to operate.
So thinking there about those, making sure that people feel validated, that they're aligned with the goals, that they take part in the goals. There is obviously another situation. We were just talking about how important one person, especially in a smaller team, the disproportionate effect of a poor performer. If you're in that situation, and I'm really interested, especially because of the scenarios that you found yourself in, if you're in that situation and you see poor performance, and you can see the impact that it's having on people around that individual, what's the best way to deal with it?
Oh, it's always a tricky one, isn't it? And I think I learned to lead an organisation where booting somebody out if they weren't good enough is pretty hard to do, and I think that's a good thing. There's so many times where people talk almost immediately about managing somebody out. It's like, whoa, wait a second. What's happened so far? It's almost like, I don't like this about this individual. I want to get rid of them. And even if they can do that, that's a really destructive thing to do on the cohesion of the team anyway. It sends a really bad message. So I think you have to take ownership over why that individual isn't performing. There's two things. There's the context and there's the individual. And as a leader, you can help shape that context. They're not performing in this environment. What can you do to change that environment? What's going on? And the thing that's really hammered into you when you're training as a leader in the army is know your people. And the more you know about them, you can start to understand, are they performing not Are they not performing for reasons that are temporary? Are there things that they need support with? And I think people can sometimes be really short term on their expectations of individuals. And if you set the conditions, well, look, I'm investing in you for a longer period of time, and if you've got this going on at the moment, you need to go away for a few weeks, sort yourself out, deal with these bits and pieces, and come back. If there's always the expectation for excellent results immediately, always, then you're not going to get it. You're just going to be constantly putting unreasonable pressure on people. So I think about it long term, about that individual, and they'll pay you back. If you invest in them when they really need it and cut them the slack when they need it, more often than not, they will pay you back times 10 for that loyalty. And I think as soon as you set that culture of, yeah, you need to go, then that's really, really tricky. Don't get me wrong, there are times when you can help support somebody and it becomes really clear that this isn't a great environment for them. And I think if you can reach that decision between you and you can help that individual transition somewhere else, then that sends such a good indication to the rest of the team. It's like, look, this hasn't worked out for this person. However, this is what we did to help them out. And I've seen really good examples of this in organizations, non-military organizations, where people have really been thoughtful about how they're helping somebody move into a better environment. So, that it's empathy at the end of the day. Even if it's somebody that you're going to have to cut from your team, doing it in the right way is really, really important, I think.
I could open the Pandora's box about football managers on that comment, but I'm not going to. I'm not going to. But I thought that related quite closely to something I know that we've talked about in the past, Matt, is the presence of a rank and file structure in the military, and I think that there's a discomfort with that kind of idea now in more contemporary organizations, in relation to things like the agile doctrine and self-organizing teams. So what do you bring when you go into those kinds of organizations with your background, and where do you see the conflicts and where do you see the benefits of rank and file and so on? Rank and order, I should say.
I love this topic because some of the most hierarchical teams I've ever come across are the ones that say we're all flat, we're all partners, we're all the same. And it's like, no, what's happening is there is a rank structure in here, in my language, but it's hidden.
And that's the worst of both worlds, presumably.
I think so. I think so. It's, preaching autonomy and be able to set your own direction, but then you have to guess what the right answers are, and if they're wrong, then you find out, and it becomes really, really complicated. And I love the concept of rank if it's used properly, because it's so easy. Like sort of, I still do Army Reserve work, which I really like, and it's so easy to go in and see somebody, and just by what they're wearing on their chest, know what level of experience they're likely to have, know what their job is, and where they sit within the organisation. And what I found is that it allows you to start interacting with that individual productively quite quickly, because you know what their job is, they know what your job is, they know what that relationship is. But that's the practical use of it. And in extremis, and has to be in extremis, is if you're more senior than somebody, then you can be directive, and authoritarian or coercive, words that some people don't like, but sometimes it's a really important thing to be able to do, so that people know who's in charge. When you need to invoke it, they know who's in charge, and that authority is vested in that individual, and that's unquestionable. And in the military context, you have to have that in place, so that when a decision needs to be made, or when something has to happen, particularly if it's unpopular, the mechanism is in place to make that happen. What we know is that, if you overuse that or use it as inappropriate, then you lose people's respect very, very quickly. So I think rank is almost to help identify who's doing what, which is really useful in an organisation. And it's in that emergency, break glass and use your rank, but not on a day-to-day basis. It could be an excuse to stop people doing what they need to do, which is build effective relationships, develop trust, create that safe environment where people can have ideas. You have to do all that stuff. And if you use rank to not bother doing that, then you're going to have quite shallow relationships with the people that you're meant to be leading. And that doesn't help anybody at all. So it's a good device, but it has to be used in the right way.
Where does that relate to the concept of agree and commit?
I can't think of many occasions where I've had to tell a soldier to do something that I haven't had the ability to discuss with them before why I'm doing it. There are certain times, and if you had to be directive, then you have the opportunity afterwards to say, this is why I did this in this situation. Not because you have to, because it helps that individual understand what happened then and what their part in it was. It's part of their development, really, not because you feel that you need to justify yourself to them. And so by the nature of joining the organisation, they're agreeing to certain things, and by nature of going through the training and understanding, they're already consenting to certain rules within an organisation. So you've already got a lot of that consent already. But more often than not, you will get people before something happens and talk about what you're going to do, help them to help shape the plan where it's opportune to do so, where it's appropriate to do so, and then you go forward and do it. You don't really, an experienced leader is not really going to want to just get people to do something where there's going to be a huge amount of dissent. They'll probably do it begrudgingly. They'll probably do a poor job because you're the boss and you're going to tell them to do it. You want them to want to do it, and that's the art bit of leadership, getting people to want to do what you want, what you need them to do, really. So I don't think rank doesn't negate the need to bring people on board and to consent to what's happening, but it does give you that ability to cut through that if you absolutely have to, or you just haven't got the time to be collaborative or really go into the reasons why things are happening the way that they are.
It's interesting you mentioned that disagree and commit, Andrew, because it was something that definitely appealed to me as a theory, but I think that was driven very strongly out of Amazon. So it was part of that whole two pizza culture. It was sort of this particular type of leadership. But this is also the same type of organization that had allegedly had Bezos claiming, if it's your opinion versus my opinion wins. But if you've got data, then obviously that takes over everything. But I do think, I really feel like Matt is talking about a very different type of organization than certainly what we see in tech, where we expect big egos. We expect this sort of intellectual battling of my opinion is better than yours. And we've had to almost create situations where there is a defined battlefield for those opinions to be turned into data and the data to do the battle for you. And it just doesn't really, I think that there is actually now a real disconnect from the type of leadership and teamship that is being trained in, that it's being driven by the big tech companies and then flowing down into everybody else, because everybody says, what does Google do? Even if you're not a tech business, if you're a larger business, all of these things flow down. And it feels like Matt really is talking about a more empathetic, egalitarian, even actually less rank-obsessed organization than we see in sort of these white collar roles, because everybody is fighting for dominance. And I've seen really weird behaviors as well, where people have also told me directly, oh, I can't have an influence because I'm not important enough. Now, we don't have a clear rank structure, but I don't have the title, so people will never take me seriously. Now, obviously, the coaching that you do in that situation is you earn the authority. You don't get it by doing a job. And if you expect authority by being promoted, you're going to be really disappointed when you get there, because it changes nothing. But it really does feel especially out of this. And actually, it mirrors a lot of the conversations that I've had with senior military leaders in the past, what we saw at the RAF officer selection, that there is actually less rank, weirdly, by virtue of almost having rank. Like you say, Matt, it's a device, it's a useful device, but it's not what everything rests on.
It's amazing. The paradox of it is the external rank and order structure diminishes its presence in the day-to-day. And in the situations that Mark's describing, it's like an internalized, embodied rank and order that people somehow have to discern from signals in the environment. And the funny thing is that, the kind of anthropological research tells us that as humans, we need hierarchy. But like Mark says, if it's not explicit and not external, then it becomes potentially far more problematic and far more intrusive in the workings of the team.
One of the features of the military as well is how you were trained to do collaborative decision making. or how you were, more correctly, how you were trained to collaborate on decision making and how that works. There's a great Colin Powell, who's ex 4-star general. I think he was Secretary of State for Defence in the States as well. And one of his famous quotes is, "Don't let your ego get too close to your position, because if one falls, the other will." And I think that's, if you're too attached to your view, then you can't be objective anymore. And there's some sort of great things you taught within the military environment about decision making. So like red teaming, for example, where if you're a senior leader, you might set one planning team off to look at one option, and the other planning team to go off and the other to do the other. And then, both sides will compare. And at the end, the leader will make the decision about what we're going to do. And then everybody works on that decision from that point onwards. The other option is thrown out and you move forward. And even if you strongly believe that it should have been option A, then that point's gone. You've had the chance to influence it. You haven't won. Let's move on to the other bit. And more often than not, what happens is the senior leader might take little bits of one plan, a little bits of the other, and create a hybrid. But it's that real important distinction. It's like when that decision's made, you all have to throw yourself behind it. Followership is how it's termed in the military, or how we use that word anyway. Regardless of whether you'd have done things differently, it doesn't matter. You now need to make this plan work as much as possible. So yeah, I think there's definitely, from what you were saying there, Mark, there's definitely something about ego. Maybe people are too close to what they think and not able to look at it objectively, and maybe not having that structure around how they make decisions. And the other interesting aspect of that is, if you're a junior captain in that brigade headquarters, you'd have the opportunity to speak on your area of expertise in front of some far more senior people. So you'd have to be pretty good. You're not going to have the floor for long. So if you really want to influence stuff, you have to be good, and you have to have the facts. But the option is open, and the senior leader would try and bring out. They'd want those people to speak. If you're a junior intelligence officer or a junior engineering officer, you want to know what they've got to say. You don't want them to be quiet and let you make a disastrous mistake. So I think there's a lot of the structure around decision making, which I don't know, maybe other sectors would potentially benefit from that. But I am aware I'm like maybe painting a really rosy picture, as in like this is how one organisation does things. And of course it's not. We're talking about sort of key features. There's good and bad in all industries and all organisations, but I think some of those differences are useful, aren't they, to sort of reflect on how you may do things in another sector.
You mentioned followership, and we can't have an army officer on without telling us a war story. And I know that we talked before, you'd mentioned that you had an anecdote about kind of a personal experience of followership from a tour in Afghanistan. Is that right?
Yes, it's just a small example. I think it was when we were chatting, and it's just something that came to mind. And it was one of the jobs we were in Kabul, and quite often we'd have to move from one part of the city, either out of the city or elsewhere. So it's not just like jumping in your Nissan Micra and pop into the shops. You have to plan the move. You have to make sure that you've got protection. You've got to make sure that you're moving 2 vehicles. There's a lot of equipment, from weapons to devices to help keep you safe, radios, etc. So it's a kind of a big deal, quite just moving from one place to another. And I must have spent not far off like a year and a half, 2 years in total in Kabul. And so I knew the city pretty well. I remember the convoy commanders wanting to go on a particular route where I knew of 2 incidents in the past where people had been able to see vehicles coming, get on their mobile phone to their mates a mile up the road and put a device out. And there'd been a couple of serious injuries, I think 1 fatality along that route. But what had happened is, because that route was hardly ever used because it was dangerous, because there'd been no intelligence reports for maybe 6 or 7 months saying that anything had happened, it had come up as a green route, which means like that's a safe option to look at. Whilst some of the routes going through the city, which aren't as nice because there are people all around, and it's at the time, there'd be one day you'd be driving through an area, it'd be completely clear. The next there'd be a market there that nobody knew about, and suddenly hundreds of people. You might get the odd stone or worse thrown at the vehicle, so it didn't feel great. But we knew we were pretty safe because no one had ever done anything in those areas, because they knew that at the time causing harm to the local population just to try and get at you wasn't going to be a great strategy. So it's counterintuitive. So I'm explaining to the person who was running the patrol, who's a sort of similar level to me, it's like, I wouldn't go down that southern route for these reasons. Just cut through the city instead for these reasons. And gone through the reports and everything. And when it came to the convoy brief, he decided to go against my advice and go through the southern route. So I remember speaking to him just after the brief. It's like, are you sure you want to do this? Like not confrontational, but why do you want to go along this route? And basically, he wanted to understand the city more. He hadn't been there before. He wanted to see a little bit more, get a bit more context, which says, okay, I get that, but for me, that's not a brilliant reason to go along somewhere where we've had a lot of incidents in the past. And so I try to influence that as much as possible. And I was in a very tricky situation where if I protested too much, suddenly everybody else on that convoy is going to be thinking, hold on, why are we doing that? And I could have basically got to set the conditions where we weren't going to go anywhere that day, or completely disenfranchise the person who had the right to make those decisions. So I was in the position where I just had to make sure that that was going to work as well as possible, that everybody knew what they needed to do without sort of creating panic or undermining the leader, making sure that we were in as good a position as possible to do something which maybe wasn't the best decision in the world. And we went through, and that was absolutely fine, no issues whatsoever. And the only reason I remember it's relatively innocuous, a minor disagreement, is that the next time when I was running a convoy, we went through the city, through the routes that I like to take. There were 2 suicide bombings along that route. Luckily, a safe distance from where we were, but the first time ever that those routes had been hit. And it just made me think about there are degrees of right and wrong, aren't there? And it's very, very rarely black and white. You're always in that grey area. And you always have to be really careful, I think, how you play it when you disagree with somebody else's ideas or somebody else's plan. You're always operating in that grey area. And I think you have to think really, really carefully before pressing the nuclear option with somebody else's idea and somebody else's plan. And what I've seen in some organizations, some sectors, they will press that button so early, they will completely blow somebody else's idea away before it's even been followed through. And you feel it's then more about ego than it is about making the best decision possible. And again, it goes back to that Colin Powell bit about it's keeping your ego and your position at a healthy distance from each other. Otherwise, you can't make those great decisions. And the importance of that followership aspect, of making sure that you are supportive of each other. You are supportive of the leader. If the leader doesn't have followers, they're not a leader, are they? At all. And so I think there's an art and a skill to being a good follower, as there is to being a good leader. But we don't pay a lot of attention to that, do we? We don't train people to be good followers very often. We don't help them to be. We concentrate maybe too much on the leadership position.
No, you're absolutely right. I saw a really nice, or I was given a really nice example of how to put people in this situation. One of my former bosses, it certainly introduced me to the idea of endorse or improve, which is when you're in a situation and you're having a discussion, you cannot just say that an idea is bad.
No.
You either endorse it, or if you disagree with it, you improve it. And I think that was one of those really simple mechanisms when you're in a meeting and use this even better if type methodology. For me, that endorse and improve methodology puts people in that situation that you're trying to get them to.
And I think whether directly or indirectly, we keep coming back to the importance of trust, don't we? Which is, if somebody's in a position that they are leading, you have to have trust that they're going to do the right thing. It may not be the same as what you would do, but you have to have enough trust in them to be able to support what they're doing. And I think if there isn't that level of trust, to even if you don't fully agree, you're going to put your weight behind that individual, then that's a big issue. And I think you can't solve that overnight. You can't build trust straight away, can you? It's something that takes a long period of time, a lot of skill to do properly. And I think maybe that's where sometimes you get newish sectors, newest organizations, newest groups of people making really big punchy decisions, and they haven't got that trust or that vested interest in each other. And maybe if they did dedicate a bit of time to getting those interactions right before you go on and do the hard stuff, maybe just that little bit of preparation, a little bit of having the rule book in place. Who's allowed to make decisions over what? What do we do if we disagree? How are we going to run with that? Sometimes just talking about those issues before the heat can be a really, really helpful strategy. So okay, what we've got here is we've got disagreement. That's great. That's going to happen. We know we're not always going to agree with things. Therefore, this is what we're going to do about it. And therefore, it sort of rationalizes disagreement. Otherwise, where does it go? You can sometimes see where there's disagreement and nobody knows where to go. Like, I think A, I think B. How do we resolve this? And it becomes really, really tricky when you haven't got the time for it to be played out.
I think we've got a few minutes left to do some quick fire questions, Matt. The first one is, what are your team red flags?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think it's when people start talking about other people when they're not there. That's always a red flag. That's just not helpful. Or saying things about the individual that they wouldn't necessarily say when they're there. There's stuff that needs to happen. There's things that need to happen there. And that's always an unhealthy sign, I think. And I think potentially the other one where it's very, very clear that the people on the team don't have that mutual respect for what the other person's doing. They're swerving into each other's lanes left, right and centre. Sorry, just had a dog invasion. So they're unable to allow other people to do their role properly. And certainly when you see an organisation getting bigger quickly, and in year one somebody's making decisions over finance, human resources, acquisitions, and then suddenly they've got a smaller remit because the organisation's grown, and sort of seeing people constantly swerving into other people's lanes, it just slows everything down. There's 10 people on a meeting where you need to have 2. So I think those are probably the two key ones.
What role do you feel most comfortable in a team?
It's definitely leading, though. I do volunteer Coast Guard roles, so we live by the coast, and I have no responsibility whatsoever on that team other than doing the functional bit, and I absolutely love that perspective. So I actually feel very comfortable having no responsibility or all the responsibility. So maybe there's a middle ground that's sort of a bit harder.
Your best team memory?
It was somebody coming up to me years after an operational tour and saying how well that experience had sort of shaped what they did next, and sort of their reflections were of a really difficult time of being incredibly positive. And at the time, it was a hard slog. So to have a member of the team sort of feel that was we did well there together, that was quite nice. Definitely.
It is, although it sounds like a small thing, it does take a lot for someone to recognize it, want to say it, go and say it. That's great. Last quick fire. Worst team experience?
Oh my gosh, what would that be? I think it was on a military training exercise when we were very junior and hadn't had much sleep. And one of my best mates decided it was a great idea to punch one of my other best mates in the face quite hard, just about before we were going to go into something which is going to take a lot of our energy. And it was just like a build-up of tension. But then it cleared very, very quickly, and actually it worked quite well. It became something we laughed about later. He didn't mean to necessarily do what he did to the individual quite as hard as he did. So just remember thinking this is going to be. I
unintentionally punch people in the face.
I think he meant to hit him
academia.
I think he just meant to like hit the guy on the shoulder, and it turned around and it turned into like. I just think this is going to be an absolute wreck. And just thinking, when you're cold and miserable, you haven't slept for ages, and then the people around you are starting to fight. It's like, this is pretty rubbish. But then actually turned out we didn't do too badly.
No, that's a good one. I think we could probably do a whole other podcast on the role of sleep deprivation and team performance.
Oh my gosh.
For another time, I imagine. And then finally, Matt, as we wrap up, we'd like to ask if you would pass on a team resource. Is there a book or a podcast or something like that you find useful that you would pass on?
Definitely. I love I talked about it a little bit earlier. There's the Colin Powell's, I think it's the 14 points of leadership. I think it's sadly passed away now, but I think he released sort of several books. So there was an extra point of leadership every time he released one. I think he started on 9 and ended up with 14 or something. That's really good. It's really well written. It's really applicable. And even though the focus is leadership, they're intrinsically linked, aren't they? Most of his points are about having healthy teams. And some very wise advice in there. So I think that's a pretty good one.
Hey, Colin Powell was a natural marketer. He's adding a point every time. That's clever.
Definitely. Maybe one to think about.
That wraps it up. Thank you so much, Matt. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you and hear all you had to say.
Very sincerely, thanks a lot for joining us today, Matt. I'm always fascinated by the military perspective because it's such an old organisation. So you would hope by now that the military would really know how to organise a team. So I really appreciated your insight.
No, you're really welcome. Look, best of luck with the book. What an exciting project.
Thank you very much for listening, and thank you to Matt Johns. In the show notes, you'll find links to Matt's company, Fieri Leadership and Development. I thoroughly recommend you check it out. You'll also find Matt's Pass It On resource, Colin Powell's 13 Rules of Leadership. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.